Hello, everyone. Welcome in. Welcome to the Women's Wellness Network, and welcome here to our guest today. Hello, Gilly. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. Or rather, I'm a bit exhausted. We just finished a food writing retreat, and it was really intense and wonderful. And I'm kind of in that post sort of amazing, intimate space that only women can share exhaustion. You know that feeling?
Yep, been there, done it, and you did it well.
Yeah, yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. So why don't you start by introducing yourself a little bit and tell us where you are in the world?
Yeah. So I'm in Brighton on the south coast of England on a very, very hot, humid day. Um, and I am a food journalist and a podcaster. I kind of come from a TV and radio background. So podcasting is kind of how I do my thing now. It's how I get my messages out. And I've been working in food for about 30 years, but podcasting is where I love to do it most. That's where I win my awards and I grow my biggest audiences and I say what I really believe in. So having made programs for everyone else all my life, I'm finally doing my own thing and loving it.
Atta girl, good for you. Right? We gotta make our own way and find the things that we love so we can actually live our life, right? As we should, instead of
Yeah,
living it for everybody else, of course.
yeah.
So, wow, a food journalist, that's so interesting. And retreats. So your retreats are for learning about food journalism, or tell us a little bit more about your retreats.
Well, I mean, it's all kind of one of those sort of happenstance things. We bought a house that fell down, and instead of going, "Oh my God, the house has fallen down," we kind of went, there's an opportunity. So we managed to get the insurance for a replacement dwelling, which is now a beautiful eco house. It on the footprint of the place that we bought before, and that is where we have lots of different retreats held by lots of different people, but where I also do my own food writing retreats and all sorts of other writing retreats. So that all came out of my podcasting. So people see what I do, they listen to my podcast, they know the kind of people I have in my world. So I host sort of monthly food writing retreats, and that's just amazing. But also, it has become a place over the last 4 years where no more than that, 6 years perhaps, where yoga leaders, coaches, executive retreats happen. It's a dry hire. I have nothing to do with it,
Right.
but magic happens. And, people say that they can tell that amazing things happen in this place. I think that the magic of each of those retreats stays in the walls and stays
Oh.
in the wildflower meadows. It kind of builds. There's an energy about amazing stuff happening.
Mm.
And, when my husband and I can't get back at the end of weekend and the yoga people are still there or they're just leaving, very often we chat to some of the people who have had extraordinary things happen to them over that weekend. They've discovered something, they found their voice, or whatever it is, they've made new friends, they've unburdened, they've talked for the first time. And, there's a lot of tears on their way out. And it's quite extraordinary to be able to. I mean, I do nothing literally. I mean, I just literally give them the keys, but there's something about having that space for ours. It's ours, and I love to share it with people.
Oh,
Yeah.
how wonderful. Yeah, it sounds like, as you say, everything stays in the walls. And when you get to communicate with
Yeah.
those people who've enjoyed it, then
Yeah.
that you carry that too. And
Totally. Totally. Totally.
yeah,
Yeah.
how wonderful.
Yeah.
Oh, that's very cool. Okay, so let's see. I know there's so many things I want to ask you. Okay, let's start with um, how did you get into being a food journalist? Like, how does one do that? What happened with that? Like, that's not a
Well,
regular run-of-the-mill career.
well, I was very lucky in that I knew a lot about food at a time when not a lot of people knew about food. And I think that was kind of key to it. I grew up with very foodie parents who had traveled around the world. My father was in the army. So they were very interested in the food from around the world and would cook a lot at home at a time when people really weren't doing that in the UK. I mean, you're very lucky. Toronto is one of the most beautiful food cities I've ever been to, but not in London at that time. So when I was working in television and radio, first of all, I really was one of the very few people who knew their way around food. I started off, making, I've always made programs about the sort of the life through the prism of food. So the political, the cultural sort of impact of food. So I was working in development in my 20s. So I was looking about the impact of funding and funding being taken away, for example, and markets collapsing on food and nutrition in Philippines and Ghana and Jamaica and all those sort of places. And so, quite quickly I became known as somebody who was kind of articulate and, food articulate, food literate. And, there weren't many people like that around at the time. And then when I went to work for a radio station when I was sort of about 29, 30, I was doing restaurant reviews in London at a time when London was only really just starting to get interesting food. And also just before that, I'd been given an expense account. I was working on a creative review magazine, and my job when I was about 23 years old was to take photographers and film directors out to lunch at a time in London when, this was the mid 80s. So Nouvelle Cuisine, remember that? Hideous little movement. But it really was kind of the first time that London sort of sparkled with a food movement. And there I was with an expense account trying it all out. And, you don't untaste that kind of food, or see that food as a movement. And I always had the kind of the journalist impulse. I'd always sort of seen where a story was happening. And so, there were not many people around, as I said, who had all of those experiences. And that's how I came to know quite a lot quite early on. And so I was given jobs when other people weren't given them, because really it was a very small pool to pick from.
Right? Yeah, well, I guess it
Um,
has to start somewhere.
well, exactly. And, I then went on to write lots of books. When my children were born, I wanted to work at home. I didn't want to work in television or radio. And so I started writing about it. And of course, writing articles, writing books. I wrote a biography of Nigella and Jamie Oliver. And then I wrote a book tracing the kind of the story of how TV chefs taught Britain to eat. So I was interviewing a lot of people who were telling the story of how Britain became a good food culture. So I kind of became an expert that way. And then, of course, I went to work for the Delicious magazine, which is one of the big food magazines in Britain. And this was only in 2016, so fairly recently. And they offered me the podcast, and it was the first food podcast in Britain that went out with the magazine. And so I
Wow.
had access. You can imagine I had access to literally everyone. So, one of my first interviews was, at Nigella's house. And,
That's very cool.
in my, it was, I just literally had access to absolutely everyone. And so my knowledge level just
Wait, I
rocketed
have to ask
again.
one question. Did she feed you?
Did she feed me? No, she did not feed me, even though her
Darn.
test people were actually cooking right there and then, but they were kind of doing recipes and stuff. No, we didn't. We talked about her latest TV show and her book. And then I was there for 4 years, and then I did my own podcast, which I'm still doing. But by which time, so that's called Cooking the Books, and that is a weekly show featuring one food writer each week about their book. And I have a format, so 4 food moments from that book, and they talk to me really intimately. So Diane Henry, who some of your people might know, is today, and she's one of our great food writers. And we go back to that time that I've just been explaining in the late 90s and the early 2000s to kind of, because we're the same age, to kind of revisit her very first book. She was one of the architects of where we are now in British food culture. So
Yeah.
it's a really interesting journey.
Yeah, it sounds very interesting and delicious. Even
Yes,
though Sullivan
exactly.
didn't feed you, that's not fair. You should have got to have a taste of everybody's, whoever you were, highlighting. They should have given you some
Yeah.
good food. That's amazing, though. Seriously, like to be able to interact with those people on such an intimate level and gain that knowledge and be able to put it to the world in a way that's digestible, let's say, for people to understand.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that, what I try and do is I've just been editing an episode that will go out in a couple of weeks with a woman who she's a food writer, but I know that she writes a lot on her Instagram about mental health. Her name's Melissa Hemsley, and she talks very openly and honestly about her journey through IVF and miscarriages and what she's done around that with retreats and wellness. And she's very open. And so we talk about it on that episode. And so, it's not just about, it's not people just promoting their book.
Right.
It is about the bigger story of them, their contribution to the canon, to that kind of food community, their use of the platform. She's got 185,000 followers on Instagram or something like that, and she uses it to make people feel to enable people to think differently about all sorts of things, but particularly the baby journey.
Oh,
So we
that's
talk a lot
very
about that.
interesting.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
people do that. Yeah.
Huh, that's very interesting. Well, I was going to ask, you know, there was that strange COVID period. How did that affect you? Because obviously we couldn't, people weren't getting out to restaurants. People weren't indulging in that kind of lifestyle. We weren't allowed. We weren't allowed, right?
Well, it was really interesting because I left Delicious in the January of 2020, and I started cooking the books in February 2020. You can see where we're going here. This is my
Wow.
first indie, self, completely on my own. And not only was I coming off a major, major magazine to try and do my own thing, then COVID struck. And so I couldn't actually get to anyone either. But it was a fantastic opportunity because it meant that I had to do everything by Zoom.
Mm,
And so I had always refused to do stuff on Zoom when I was at Delicious, but this meant that I only had one possibility. And I was doing quite a few other podcasts by this time, and I was writing a book about podcasting. So I was doing a lot of interviews with top podcasters around the world because I could with Zoom. And so I was thinking, well, on my brand new indie podcast, Cooking the Books, who do I really, really want to interview? And of course, Obama's favorite chef is Dan Barber in upstate New York. And I wouldn't have been able to get to him, but via Zoom, and because he was doing nothing else because his restaurant was closed, he said yes. So I had Dan Barber as one of the very first guests on my show. And once I had somebody of his caliber,
right.
then of course everybody else is going to say yes. So it was great for me. And the other thing that was happening was that I'm now produce lots of other food podcasts, and I was producing the Food Foundation podcast, which is all about food insecurity.
Mm,
And I had literally been in the middle of making a program about free school meals and the impact of kids who can't get a proper breakfast and things like that.
right.
And white middle class woman sort of putting a microphone under the nose of a sort of a 13-year-old child living in food insecurity is not
Right.
really how I want to make things.
Yeah.
So with COVID, suddenly I was saying to them, okay, let me show you how to tell your own stories using your phone as a recorder. And so I had this army of kids whose lives were being turned upside down. Their parents might have been key workers. They might be looking after their cousins, for example, and trying to feed them on nothing in the cupboard. And I was getting them to record it all on their phones and send it to me. And then I could put it on the podcast, which meant that it was out on all the big national radio stations. And that story of food insecurity was getting top billing. Everybody was getting to hear about it because I couldn't physically get to these kids.
Mm.
And we had to think of a different way. So actually, you know, I
The
can't say
benefits
that
of it, right? The benefits
it
of
was
it.
pretty amazing. It was pretty
That is
amazing.
awesome.
Yeah,
Yeah, well, I mean
yeah,
that subject even, food insecurity, right? Like that's
yeah,
very on all wellness levels. That affects your bottom line, your
totally.
safety, security, your root chakra, like the basis of your being,
Absolutely.
and you want to have that. So yeah, good for
Exactly.
you to bring some highlight to that.
Yeah. I mean, it's the mother, the what is it called? Necessity, the mother of invention. Necessity is the mother of invention. And it really was. I mean, we couldn't not tell those stories. We couldn't not do the Food Foundation podcast. And we had some very important stories to tell, and the podcast via that means that was incredibly powerful.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, like we say, right? There's so many things that are positive that did come out of that time period for us, especially as women. I think we really understand now that we can do things for ourselves. There are opportunities, there are platforms, there are ways to connect without, without even leaving your home if you don't want to, right?
Yeah,
So yeah,
absolutely.
teaching, yeah,
Yeah,
people
and
learning
and you
that.
know, what I found was really interesting was the kind of the intimacy of Zoom. So, you and I are talking now, you're just outside Toronto, I'm in Brighton in England, and yet we're having a really intimate conversation that, yeah, we probably would have over a cup of coffee if you and I met in
Right,
real life. But, realistically, the idea of us getting together to have that coffee, when it's much more difficult. And I was finding that even the big celebrities who I was interviewing, if I were meeting them, say, I know you probably won't know these names, but say Rick Stein, you probably do have him on American and Canadian television as well. But anyways, big name here. And, when I was at Delicious, I would have lunch with him, and I would be very aware that I would be one in a line of maybe 10 journalists who are going to be meeting him either over lunch or tea or in a cafe or whatever that day, or on the phone or whatever. And it's a press junket, one after the
right,
other. But actually, you know, if I get him on Zoom, there is a different experience. It's like you and me now.
yeah,
There's no one else. There's no PR kind of watching the time and saying, come on, that's enough. It's just me and him.
right.
And that gives me, and during lockdown, it was really interesting because a lot of people were going through some really, really big stuff.
Oh
I
yeah,
remember to a chef called Raymond Blanc, whose mother had died, and he was crying. He's a huge, huge chef and food writer in this country, and Europe. And he was crying. And, I was holding that space for him, and he felt comfortable enough to be able to talk about his Maman Blanc, as he used to call her. And, she appears in all his programs on television and all his books. And she died, about 3 days before I spoke to him. And yeah, I think that Zoom gives you a really intimate connection. It's really interesting. I remember some artists were doing an exhibition about the space that you take up on Zoom. So, how what does body language do when you've only got a little space? How do you and they did this amazing exhibition of the way different artists perceiving the way that people use this much smaller space to create a connection. So interesting.
right. To create even a bigger, bolder themselves than
Yeah.
they might get. Like myself, right? I'm sitting here, I have this beautiful background behind me. If we met for coffee, I would not have this beautiful background behind me, right? So there are little nuances and things that yeah get added
Yeah.
in, and
Mm.
just the whole comfort, I guess, of being able to be in your own space even while you're having a conversation helps open up in different ways. That's how I find it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I find that, I always send instructions on how to get the best sound quality. So it has to be padded for my podcast, so it makes them sound like they're in the same room as me. And very often it means going into their kids' bedrooms, where there are lots of teddies and duvets and cushions and all that sort of stuff. And so, some of the biggest chefs in the world are sitting in their daughter's bedroom with their teddies. And only I can see them because I only do audio, I don't do video.
Right.
And it kind of adds a nice little dynamic.
Oh my gosh, that is very sweet. I think that's beautiful. And you wouldn't get that otherwise, right? You wouldn't be able to have that moment
Yeah.
or that connection in that way. So yeah, when people feel more comfortable, it's easier for things to just flow and just
Yeah.
come out and you
Yeah.
get to have some nuggets that maybe you wouldn't get otherwise, I
Yeah.
think ultimately, right? So
Yeah.
what are your next adventures? What are you doing next? Are you writing another book? You've got your podcast going. What are you doing?
I am expanding the retreats.
Mm,
So my dream is I call the house of dreams because
love that.
amazing things happen there. And I want to curate. I meet so many amazing people, and they're not all food people, but I meet them through my world. There are some people who are teaching people to communicate in a way that is just mind blowing, just clearer, speaking from the heart. And these are men. I've got two men who are really changing the way that people communicate about their values, for example, their values in business. And so they're talking to other men, they're talking to women as well. But I think what's really interesting is that they're talking to men and not the kind of men who you would expect to go to a retreat, sort of burly men who may have been brought up in a much more sort of, masculine environment, perhaps. And they're teaching them to think more deeply about their values. And I want to get those sort of people together with really some progressive corporates. There's lots of B Corp companies around here, people doing really extraordinary stuff and thinking differently, getting them together to see what will happen at and what retreats we can create together. Maybe I'll get an amazing chef or a food writer down to do an amazing lunch or a dinner, just to put, I'm sort of putting them all in my pot and I'm stirring
Yeah.
them all together to make
Yes,
a delicious
I'm
recipe.
I'm thinking about the way to a man's heart is through his stomach. So that's the perfect thing, food with the men and softening them by using that. And that is
Yeah,
amazing. Oh my gosh. And I think there's a
yeah,
lot more need for retreats in that way for men because there just really doesn't seem to be a lot out there yet. People are just
yeah,
starting to realize that men want that too, or deserve that too, or need that too, whatever it is, right? Women have always
yeah,
seemed to have these things going and it's just easier for women to connect in that kind of way so that, you know, I really appreciate that that is a thing, that there's people out there who are looking at that. And heart-centered men, helping men become heart-centered. Oh,
yeah,
that's so beautiful.
yeah. Absolutely. And, I think that what's happening is that, it's our mental health, it's our physical well-being and the well-being of the planet is kind of coming together as these shared values. And people are wanting to connect with other people who are thinking that way and they want to make it relevant for their businesses as well. So, I mean, I had literally nothing to do with this retreat. I just literally dry hired my house out to this guy, but he made a video which I put on my LinkedIn, and it's just so amazing. He said, he's standing in the wildflower meadows and he's talking about the role of nature in helping him to deliver his theory, his thesis to these guys. And then this guy, who one of his clients, talks about the effect. And you really wouldn't expect that kind of guy to be speaking that kind of language. And it's really humbling. So I want lots more of that. And, I want to, I mean, I already do curate lots and lots of extraordinary experiences. We have supper clubs at the house as well. And we have all sorts of, I have a day called Shaping the Side Hustle, where I get amazing people just to kind of come and, with their ragtag ideas of something that they've always put on the side, but then we shape it and they leave at the end of the day just ready to go with it. So there's all sorts of things that happen at the House of Dreams,
Oh,
but I want
so
to do
fun.
much more of it. Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. Okay, yeah, we need to get that information out there. So, if people want to find out more about you, how can they do that?
So the best way is to contact me. I'm really open to ideas and collaborations. I'm Gilly with a G, Gilly at gillysmith.com. And I'll get back to you. Tell me what you're looking for, and if you're looking for a venue in southeast England, it's only an hour from London, so it's really easy. But we are very rural. We're totally enclosed by trees. We have woodland. We have 10 acres of land. We have two ponds. It really does feel. We have an owl hooting at night. Nothing to do with us. We didn't bring him in. We have bats flying around. I mean,
But
it is.
because of the atmosphere and the energy that's there is why they stay, right?
Yeah, very probably. Yeah.
Good energy.
Yeah, yeah. And And so, yeah, so get in touch and let me know what we can do together.
Oh, that's wonderful. Okay, Women of the Women's Wellness Network, we will put all of Jilly's information into the comments section and reach out to her. Check out what she has to, has to offer in ways of her own offerings, some books and her podcast, her retreat center, House of Dreams. I love that. Um, and also women, we have men in our lives. So if you are anywhere in the vicinity of London, um, maybe send your men to Jilly. Maybe help them understand, there's an opening for them also. It's not everything is just for women. We love our
Yeah,
men. We want to take care of them too. So
yeah,
reach out and
yeah.
connect if you can, and that would be amazing. And Jilly, thank you so much for coming today. It was lovely to meet
Thank you,
you
Tammy.
and
It's
speak
been
with
really,
you.
and you. Yeah.
Awesome. All right, everybody, until next time, be well.
Thank you. Bye bye.